Last time I checked, Autotune was just way too expensive. Let's check again. Autotune for the professional. Not interested in the subscription. Now this costs 516 euro, which is, I mean, when I spend money on a plugin, then when it costs 100 euro, I already expect it to be super next level. And Autotune is like, it's a very cool effect. Everyone loves it a little bit. Everyone who doesn't hate it, at least. But it's not very innovative anymore. You know, you would expect the price to go down at some point and not stay higher than everything else ever before. Even analog emulation scams are cheaper than this. So Autotune is way too expensive, but we want to have an auto-tuned sound. What can we do? When this topic comes up online, I often see people recommending Melodyne because Melodyne is quote unquote better because it is an offline process. Now, disregarding that Autotune also added a feature for offline editing notes, even considering that Autotune was a real-time only effect in the beginning, I would say Melodyne was not just objectively better, but it is objectively different and it's objectively better in its own way. What I mean by that is that the artifacts that are created by a plugin like Autotune, they started off sounding a bit weird to the human ear, but now they are actually desirable. They are kind of introducing all these ornament artifacts around the pitch changes of a melody, and that's kind of why people use Autotune. Cause let's be honest, if we wanna pitch vocals, then we're using Melodyne. Melodyne already is a perfectly suitable tool for that. And when people actually load up an instance of Autotune, they are doing it because of the artifacts of Autotune and because they want these artifacts in their music. So in some way, it is kind of weird to call them artifacts. So instead, I will call them ornaments now. So what would you have to do if you wanted to create the artifacts of an Autotune track in Melodyne? Let's check that out, because in this project I have a vocal take.
I'm dumb, I sing everything you want, I'm made of zeros and ones.
So now I bounced some vocals into this track. You can see them here, can zoom in. And if you want it to sound a bit more like Autotune, like the classic Autotune robotic effect, you would tune all of these as sharp as possible. You would remove all the vibrato and you would start adding ornaments by just throwing some of these in here. And you have to tune them again then for some reason. And then you can shift them around to different notes that are also in the same scale. And that will hopefully sound a bit like the Autotune-ish artifacts.
I'm dumb, I sing everything.
Yeah, this sounded a lot like an Autotune artifact. The problem is just that this is not like synced to the grid, and the grid of Melodyne is kinda rough. It's in quarter notes, so it's not very suited for coming up with super short ornaments that should still be super hard on time. The original Autotune artifacts are also not beat sync, but that is a problem that you should keep in mind because it will be solved in the workflow that I'm presenting very soon. Also, these were quite a lot of steps just to get an artifact into the vocal take. So also keep that in mind, because both of these things will be solved right now. Let's get rid of Melodyne again. I will not talk about the whole chain of effects that I used here because some of that will be covered in a different video, but I will talk about Manipulator, which is a plugin by Polyverse. When I turn it off, the vocal take sounds like this.
I'm dumb, I sing everything you want, I'm made of zeros and ones, so let me solve.
So as you can hear, this sounds very different. It doesn't sound as much like a specific vibe as with Manipulator enabled. When it's enabled, you can clearly hear that it's going for some sort of hyperpop sound. And you can already see it a little bit in the background here. The ornaments are actually written in MIDI. And this is pretty cool because it already solves one of the problems that you can find in both Melodyne and in Autotune, but for different reasons, which is that the ornaments are not synced to musical values like beat values like 16th or 32th notes or whatever this is. When you're using the workflow with Manipulator, you can actually make ornaments that are synced to some musical values. So it kind of goes even beyond what you can do with Autotune. And the second thing that is solved by this workflow is consistency, because in Autotune, when you are looping the same part over and over again, it will always sound a little bit different, while here you will always get the same kind of ornaments. In Melodyne, you don't have the problem that loops sound a little bit different, so that's not a problem that you get there. But Melodyne, due to the grid lines being very far apart from each other, has the problem that it's kind of hard to figure out ornaments that are quite fast, that also should sound kind of musical. So this is now solved. I want to show you something now, because you can also use Manipulator without MIDI input. For that, I will just put a single note at the start, only to trigger Emvoice One, the vocal synthesizer that is being used here. Manipulator itself doesn't get MIDI input, so now you only hear what Manipulator does without the ornaments. So without the MIDI input, it is definitely also already a great effect. Like, you can transpose the pitch up an octave and you can play around with the formant to kind of get the kind of sound that you want from the vocal take, but it's not quite the tight sound yet. And that's why it's cool that this plugin actually has a MIDI input, the glide parameter. When turning up, it turns more natural. It doesn't quite fit to the way I wrote the ornaments now, because when you're using higher glide values, it makes sense to also make the ornaments a little bit wider. But just so you have seen this feature, you can turn the glide up to ridiculous amounts. Sounds kind of crazy. I should do that sometimes. So what does Manipulator cost? As an official beta tester for Polyverse, I have gotten it for free, to be honest, but you know, I put work into testing it, so that's also worth a lot, maybe even more than $150. But $150 is the price for this plugin. You can see that is already much less than Autotune, and you can even get sounds out of it that are cooler than Autotune in some cases. Now, as you can see in this demonstrational image, you can also attach modulators to all of the knobs, and then they will pop up as these funky colors. I am not really using this feature a lot, because honestly, I like my sounds to just be set and forget sometimes. But I know some of you are going really hard with modulation systems, so just so you know, there is a modulation system here. And yeah, these other knobs are also kind of crazy, but they can really mess with the speech intelligibility. So if you're just going for a slightly tighter sound that also has formant control, then this section is already more than enough. And all of this stuff is just the optional additional stuff that you can use to go even harder. I also want to show you some other examples of how I use this plugin in this project, so that you can see some variation. So this is the main vocal part.
Now let me show you the songs I wrote for you. Singing them is what I like to do.
And without Manipulator, it would sound like this.
Now let me show you the songs I wrote for you. Singing them is what I like to do.
Emvoice One has some variations on the voice when you buy the plugin. The free version just has the default voice, but I have these variations, and some of them are a little bit higher in the formants and some of them are a little bit lower. But you don't have direct control on the formants in this plugin. So it's cool that you can just load Manipulator after it to really get the formant to be just where you want it. And as you can see, I have chosen a higher glide setting here than on the other track. And let's look at the ornaments and the way I wrote them. For example here. Now this makes the LED sound more like a LED instead of LED. So you can see this was more flat, and you can also make it come from above, which sounds a little bit hysteric. When I'm making these super hyper pop Autotune robotic tracks, I let all of the ornaments be on notes that are actually in the scale. But when I'm choosing this softer slide setting, it can actually make sense to sometimes choose notes that are not on the scale but just feel right. You can see that here.
The songs I wrote for you.
As you can hear, this sounds super plausible, but this note is definitely not in the scale. I show you another vocal line just because it's fun.
Singing them is what I like to do.
especially in conjunction with Emvoice One. This is a lot of fun because Emvoice One already has its own piano roll. You are basically defining all the melodies in here. But then you can just hop into Manipulator and change it here and there a little bit in the piano roll of your DAW, which probably has a better workflow. Because in my opinion, Emvoice One still has to work out the workflow of the piano roll a little bit. So it's kind of nice that you don't have to do everything in Emvoice One, but you can just lay down the rough thing and go on with Manipulator. Now one last part. I have this epic part at the end, which just goes really hard. And here I have epic Lucy vocals, which sound like this. And so on. So on the main layer I have Manipulator with a very high glide setting. This is already very high. And you can see it gliding to the next note really slowly. So let's look at the notes while playing it back. And you can see some things that are actually very interesting. For example, this looks like something that results in a super flat sound, at least when the glide is lower. But since the glide is so high, what this actually does is just making sure that once this note actually starts, it has more or less reached this note finally. So this note is just for letting this note already go up in time. And then there is also this peculiar section at the end where I'm just going down, but I don't even expect it to actually reach this lower note. I just wanted to go down in general to have an at the end of this line to just make sure that it does sound like this is the end of one of the lines, because they are connected in time, but it should still sound like the end of a line. So this is what can make the difference when you're using multiple instances of Manipulator. An interesting addition here is I have this Lucy Extreme 2 track, which is basically receiving the output from Lucy Extreme 1, but not from the end of the track, but from the output of Emvoice One. So this is basically a layer. I could have done this with a layer inside of this chain as well, but I didn't. For a good reason, because I wanted to have a different MIDI track here. Now I have two different MIDI melodies and also Manipulator on this one, but here I chose to actually set glide to 0 so that I have this super sharp sound on top of the super glidey sound. Let's put both of the melodies on top of each other and listen to it in solo because it's beautiful. Beautiful. Emvoice One in general is already a plugin that I really enjoy. But slapping Manipulator on it is just and I hope that after listening to all of these tracks you don't feel like I'm just trying to sell you a plugin or anything. I was not given money for this, just a plugin. And they didn't tell me to make a video, by the way. I'm really just doing that because I just realized how good this combination Emvoice One and Manipulator is, and I just wanted to show that. Give me a like, give me a subscribe, give me all your money, have a child with me, introduce me to your parents. Let's go!